Hey, stop for 1 second before we go anywhere. I want to know something. Something simple. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Your city, your country, even just your continent? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I mean that. I am not a channel that pretends. I actually sit there and I read them. And while you are down there, tell me what time it is where you are right now. Seriously, is it midnight? 2 in the morning? Are you watching this on your lunch break? Early morning before anyone else in the house is awake? I genuinely want to know. Just say your location and your time. That is it. 2 things. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to a small channel that is trying to build something real with real people. Now, today's like goal. Are you ready? 10 likes. That is the entire goal. 10. If you have ever watched a video on this channel and felt something, this is how you say so. Just 10. And if you are brand new here and you stumbled onto this video somehow, welcome. This channel goes deep on history that does not get the attention it deserves. The strange, the documented, the officially unexplained. If that is your kind of thing, hit subscribe. You will not regret it. All right, I have kept you long enough. Let me take you somewhere cold. It is January 1943. The temperature has not risen above -24 degrees in 2 weeks. The trees in this particular stretch of forest are so dense that even in daylight you cannot see more than 30 meters in any direction. At night you cannot see your own hand unless you raise it against the sky. A Soviet patrol of 6 men enters the forest at 0100 hours. They have a route. They have orders. They have been at the front long enough that none of them are nervous about a routine patrol anymore. They do not come back when they are supposed to. When 3 of them do return 4 hours late, the officer who receives them later writes in his report that he almost did not recognize them, not because of wounds, not because of frostbite, because of their faces. He writes, they looked like men who had seen something they did not have the language for. When they are debriefed separately in 3 different rooms by 3 different officers, they each describe the same thing, the same height, the same posture, the same movement, the same silence, and that is only the first account. There are 14 more. Before we go any further, I need to place you inside the real history, because this story only works if you understand what these men were already living through before any of the strange events began. And what they were living through was, by any historical measure, one of the most extreme human experiences ever documented. We are on the Eastern Front, Soviet Union, specifically the Leningrad Oblast, the region surrounding the city of Leningrad, during the winter of 1942 into 1943. This is not a peripheral theater of the Second World War. This is its center of gravity. More human beings died on the Eastern Front between 1941 and 1945 than in every other theater of the war combined. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Military historians estimate over 8 million Soviet and German military deaths, and that does not count civilians. The Volkhov River region, specifically, was the site of one of the most catastrophic Soviet military disasters of the entire war. The Soviet Second Shock Army, operating under General Andrei Vlasov, was sent to relieve the siege of Leningrad. Instead, it was encircled by German forces and systematically destroyed through the spring and summer of 1942. By the time the encirclement was complete, somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 Soviet soldiers had died in those forests. The exact number is still debated by historians today. This is documented history. David Glantz, one of the foremost Western scholars of Eastern Front operations, covers the Volkhov pocket in detail in his 2002 work on the Battle for Leningrad. The Soviet archival records, many of which were only opened after the collapse of the USSR, confirm the scale of the disaster. But Glantz's books do not cover what some of the surviving soldiers from that sector reported seeing during the winter that followed. The surviving units of the Soviet 54th Army and 8th Army, now holding a static defensive line along the eastern edge of the Volkhov forest sector, were not fighting major offensive operations in the winter of 1942 to 1943. They were holding the line, conducting patrols, surviving. The temperature records from that winter, preserved in Soviet meteorological archives, show sustained temperatures between -20 and -30 degrees Celsius across the region. Supply lines were partially functional at best. Both sides were chronically short of winter equipment, food, and medical supplies. The forest floor was frozen solid beneath 2 feet of snow. Artillery fire had stripped sections of the forest bare. In other sections, the trees were so dense that entire engagements had been fought at arm's reach. These men knew this forest intimately. They had lived in it for months. They knew its sounds, its rhythms, its particular way of playing tricks on exhausted eyes and ears. Which is why, when the reports began to come in, the officers who received them did not immediately dismiss them. Because the men filing these reports were not new. They were not frightened conscripts on their first patrol. They were veterans. And veterans, as any military officer will tell you, do not file reports about things they think they imagined. But it was not the enemy that certain soldiers in that sector feared most that winter. It was something the enemy had not sent. His name was Pyotr Alexeyevich Morosov, Sergeant, 376th Rifle Division, Soviet Red Army. He was 26 years old. He came from Ryazan, a city about 200 kilometers southeast of Moscow, where he had worked before the war as a surveyor. He was, by the nature of his peacetime profession, a man trained to observe the physical world with precision and to record what he saw accurately. He had been at the front since September of 1941. By January of 1943, that was 16 months of continuous combat. He had survived the summer encirclements, the autumn retreats, and one full winter already in these forests. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Shevtsov, described him in a preserved unit commendation report as, and I am translating from the Russian here, reliable, precise in observation, calm under pressure, not given to complaint or exaggeration. He had been recommended for promotion twice. I want you to hold that portrait in your mind, reliable, calm, not given to exaggeration, because what I am about to read you comes from a man who fits that description. Morozov's account survives in 2 separate documents. The first is a personal letter he wrote to his wife, Natalia, in Leningrad, dated January 14th, 1943. That letter was preserved by his wife throughout the siege of Leningrad, through the liberation, through the entire remaining decades of her life, and was eventually donated by her granddaughter to the Memorial Society archive in Moscow. The Memorial Society was a Russian human rights and historical research organization that spent decades collecting exactly this kind of personal documentation. It was forcibly dissolved by the Russian government in 2021, and its archives are now in legal dispute. The second document is a formal intelligence debriefing transcript, partially declassified in 1997, from Soviet military intelligence files covering the Volkhov sector. Both accounts describe the same night, the same forest, the same encounter. Neither document was written with any knowledge of the other's existence. It is the night of January 12, 1943, 0230 hours. Morozov's patrol, 6 men total, has been moving along a frozen tree line for approximately 90 minutes. Their route takes them along the eastern edge of a forested ridge above a shallow valley. To their left, dense forest. To their right, an open field of perhaps 250 meters of flat snow, beyond which lies another tree line belonging to no man's land. The sky is partly clear. There is starlight but no moon. Visibility in the open, perhaps 50 meters. Visibility inside the tree line, almost nothing. The patrol has been silent for 20 minutes. No enemy contact. No unusual sounds. Morosov is third in the line of 6 men, which places him in the center of the formation. Then the man at the rear of the patrol raises his fist. Stop. No one speaks. No one moves. The entire patrol freezes in place, weapons coming up instinctively, eyes scanning the open field to the right. Nothing in the field. The rear man turns and points. Not toward the field. Behind them. Back along the tree line they have just walked through. Morosov turns. And at the edge of the tree line, perhaps 40 meters behind the last man in the patrol, standing completely still in a narrow gap between 2 fir trees. Something is standing there. In his letter to his wife, Morosov chose his words very carefully. I say that because the letter itself shows evidence of care. Crossed out words, sentences that were restarted. He was trying to say something precisely and struggling to find the right language. What he eventually wrote was this. It was upright, the way a man is upright. It was taller than any man I have stood next to. It did not move the way an animal moves, and it did not stand the way a man stands. When Grigori raised his rifle, it looked at him. I do not know how I know it looked at him. I did not see its face, but I know it looked at him. He stopped there. The next paragraph of the letter asks whether his wife has received the food parcel he sent in November. He never returned to the subject in any letter that survived. But the intelligence debriefing conducted 3 days later is more detailed, because the officer conducting the debriefing was specifically asking follow-up questions that Morozov's letter never prompted. The debriefing establishes the following. The figure was observed for approximately 4 to 5 minutes before the patrol withdrew. It did not advance. It did not retreat. It moved once laterally along the tree line, covering perhaps 20 meters, in a movement that witnesses described as deliberate and slow. After that single movement, it became still again and remained still until the patrol was out of visual range. When the debriefing officer asked Morozov directly whether he believed he had seen a human being, Morozov paused for a long time before answering. Then he said, "Not a man, but I don't have a better word for it. I need to pause here for just a second, because I want to know where you stand right now before we go any further." Drop it in the comments. Was what Morozov saw a psychological episode, an animal, or something that does not fit either category? 3 options. Which one are you leaning toward right now? Tell me. I want to see what this community thinks before we look at the other 14 accounts. All right, back to the record, because it gets harder to dismiss from here. It is now 0247 hours. The patrol stopped at 0232. They have been standing in place for 15 minutes. 6 men, 6 rifles, in minus 23-degree cold, and none of them have spoken a word. The figure at the tree line has not moved since its lateral step. It stands in the gap between 2 fir trees, at the edge of where the starlight reaches, and it is perfectly still. Morozov will later struggle to describe its stillness as anything other than intentional. Animals are still when they are hunting or hiding. This, he tells the debriefing officer, felt like neither. It felt like it was simply waiting to see what the patrol would do. Private Grigory Sokolov is 20 years old. He is from Novgorod. He has been at the front for 8 months. He is not the most experienced man in the patrol, but he is, by his own later account, the one who breaks the silence first. Not with words. He fires a single round, not at the figure, into the ground 3 meters in front of it. This is standard Soviet patrol protocol for an unidentified ground contact at night. A warning shot, a challenge. It establishes military presence and invites a response from a human being, because a human being responds to a warning shot in predictable ways. They identify themselves, they drop, they run, they return fire. The figure does none of these things. The shot rings across the open field and echoes off the far tree line, and then the silence comes back, and it comes back completely. And the figure is still standing there in the exact position it was in before the shot was fired. It has not flinched. It has not moved laterally again. It has not looked toward the sound of the shot. Or if it has done so in a way that is invisible from 40 meters in near darkness. Morosov observes two things simultaneously. First, that his own body has stopped functioning the way it normally functions under threat. His hands are steady, his breathing is controlled, but something at the center of him has gone very quiet in a way that combat has never made it go quiet. Combat makes his body loud, fight or flight, adrenaline. He knows this feeling. He has lived inside for 16 months. This is not that feeling. This is something older and much simpler than fear. It is the feeling he will try to write to his wife, of being observed by something that has been observing things for much longer than he has been alive. Second, he realizes that the man behind him, Private Yegor Baranov, is quietly, under his breath. Not a formal prayer, just the same 4 words repeated. Morozov cannot hear what they are, but he can see Baranov's lips moving, and he can see that Baranov's rifle is no longer raised. He gives the order, withdraw, quietly, the way they came. Now, the patrol moves, not running. Running is wrong. Morozov knows this without being able to articulate why. Running is an invitation to something. Walking backward, slowly, watching the tree line, weapons up, is not an invitation. It is a refusal. They move for approximately 3 minutes before Sokolov speaks. He says, very quietly, without stopping walking, "It followed us." Morozov does not look back. He tells the patrol to keep moving. He does not look back. He will say this several times in the debriefing, as if making sure the officer understands. He did not look back. Sokolov looks back once, a single glance over his shoulder. He does not speak again for the rest of the night. In his own separate debriefing, Sokolov is asked what he saw when he turned. He says the figure was still at the tree line. It had not advanced. It had not disappeared. It was standing in the open, fully visible, no longer between the trees, and it had turned. It was facing them directly now, watching them leave. Now, here is where I need you to adjust your thinking slightly. Because everything we have covered so far is one incident, from one patrol, from one side of one conflict. If it were only that, you and I could both walk away with a clean explanation and sleep soundly. But it is not only that. Let me walk you through the other accounts, carefully, because the details are where this becomes genuinely difficult to explain. The second account comes from a German source. Hauptmann Verfelt was a company commander in the 126th Infantry Division, Wehrmacht, positioned on the western side of the Volkhov line. During the same winter of 1942 to 1943, his personal field diary was recovered by British forces at the end of the war and passed to the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg, where it remains. In an entry dated January 19, 1943, exactly 1 week after Morozov's patrol, Felt records a sentry report from his forward outpost. A single figure observed at the forest edge, approximately 30 to 40 meters from the sentry position, upright, unmoving, unresponsive to a verbal challenge issued twice in German and once in Russian. Gone by first light with no tracks found in the snow by the morning patrol. Felt's assessment in his own handwriting is 4 words: phenomenon unexplained, sentry credible. Let me say that again. A German officer. 1 week later, opposite side of the line. Same forest sector, same description, and his conclusion was not sentry was hallucinating. His conclusion was credible. The third account predates the war entirely, which is the detail that changes the nature of this story most fundamentally. In 1931, a Soviet ethnographer named Yevgenia Kashina conducted fieldwork in the villages of the Leningrad Oblast as part of a broader Soviet program to document regional folklore before collectivization erased it. Her study, published in a small academic volume by Leningrad State University Press, documents oral traditions from 11 villages in the region. Multiple villages, without contact with each other according to Kashina's own notes, described a recurring figure in the forests. Tall, upright, silent, seen at forest edges in winter, present in folk memory for as long as anyone could remember. Not aggressive, never seen in daylight, never leaving tracks. Kashina published this in 1931, 12 years before the war reached this forest. She was not writing about soldiers. She was writing about farmers and woodcutters who had no army and no war and no reason to be collectively traumatized. And yet what they described to her is what 6 Soviet soldiers and at least 1 German sentry would describe over a decade later. The fourth account is the one that officially does not exist. On February 3rd, 1943, a reconnaissance patrol from the Soviet 54th Army, 7 men, entered the forested sector north of the Volkhov positions and did not return. Both Soviet and German military records confirm that no combat action took place in that specific area on that specific date. No mines were registered as detonated, no artillery fired, no small arms fire was reported by either side. When the bodies were recovered during the spring thaw, the Soviet after-action report noted, and I want to read this precisely, cause of death indeterminate. No wounds consistent with enemy fire, ordnance fragmentation, or hand-to-hand combat. Environmental exposure as primary cause cannot be confirmed. Case closed pending further review. The further review is not recorded anywhere in the file. The file was marked restricted and remained so until 1991. 7 men, no enemy contact on record, no explanation in the file. The fifth account comes from an oral history collected in Leningrad in 1978 by a researcher at Leningrad State University's History Department as part of a project documenting the experiences of Eastern Front veterans. The veteran interviewed, a man who served in the Volkhov sector in 1943, and who agreed to speak only on the condition that his full name not be published during his lifetime, said the following. He died in 1984. The transcript was published in an academic volume in 1996. He said, everyone in that sector knew something was in the trees. It was not discussed. You did not discuss it, because discussing it felt like it brought it closer. The officers knew too. They just never put it in writing, because you cannot put something in writing that you cannot explain, not if you want to keep your rank. But we all knew. Every man who spent a winter in that forest knew. Every man who spent a winter in that forest knew. I want to be honest with you right now, because this is the part of a video like this where it is very tempting to just let the mystery breathe and move on. But that would not be doing this story justice, and it would not be doing you justice. So let's actually look at the explanations, the real ones, the ones that researchers and military historians have considered when they have encountered accounts like these. And let's look at exactly where each one holds up, and exactly where it does not. This is the most scientifically grounded explanation, and it deserves the most serious treatment. The research on combat-induced perceptual distortion is real, it is substantial, and it has been ongoing since the First World War. A landmark study by British military psychiatrists, published in the British Journal of Psychiatry in 1947, and drawing on interviews with over 300 Eastern Front veterans from multiple nations, identified a phenomenon they called sustained threat projection. Under conditions of extreme cold, severe sleep deprivation, chronic malnutrition, and constant threat of death, the human brain begins to assign defined form and hostile intent to ambiguous visual stimuli. A shadow becomes a shape becomes a figure becomes something with purpose. The researchers found that this phenomenon was most pronounced in soldiers who had been at the front for over 8 months, who were operating in low-light conditions, and who were in environments where actual threats had previously emerged from the same type of ambiguous stimuli. In other words, a soldier who has been shot at from a forest tree line enough times will eventually begin seeing things in forest tree lines. This explanation accounts for Morosov's experience. It does not account for Felt's. Felt was on the opposite side of the line. There was no shared psychological trigger, no shared cultural framework, no possibility of cross-contamination between their accounts. Both men, from opposing armies, describing the same silhouette in the same forest within 1 week of each other. The Leningrad Oblast and the broader northwestern Russian forest zone is one of the least biologically surveyed wilderness areas in Europe. The reasons for this are largely political. Soviet-era access restrictions, wartime damage, and post-war military zones kept large portions of this forest outside the reach of naturalists for decades. What we do know is that the region supports brown bears, European wolves, and European lynx, all of which are capable of moving through dense forests silently. A brown bear standing upright reaches between 1.8 and 2.3 meters. That matches the height description in multiple accounts, but bears hibernate. January in the Volkhov sector is not when bears are moving through forests, and even if a bear were active in those conditions, the behavioral description does not match. The lateral movement along the tree line while maintaining visual orientation toward an armed group of 6 men is not bear behavior. A bear faced with 6 men and a rifle shot investigates or retreats. It does not reposition itself to a new observation point. It does not remain when a weapon is discharged at close range, and it does not leave no tracks in 2 feet of snow. Both the Wehrmacht and Soviet military intelligence ran documented psychological operations throughout the Eastern Front campaign. Disguises, staged sounds, deliberate disinformation, the manufacturing of supernatural fear, all of these were used to some degree by both sides in various theaters. The idea of deploying a costumed figure at night to undermine enemy morale is theoretically within the operational capacity of both armies. But this theory requires the following chain of coincidences: that both sides, independently, ran an identical operation in the same forest sector at nearly the same time, using the same figure design, without any record of the operations surviving in any archive on either side, and without any soldier from either side ever disclosing it in any post-war testimony. It also requires that Kashina's 1931 ethnographic folklore subject somehow fits the same design that military psychological operations teams arrived at 12 years later. That is not logically impossible. It is, however, the least parsimonious explanation by a significant margin. And I want you to sit with this one for a moment before you dismiss it. If Kashina's 1931 ethnographic data is accurate, and there is no documented reason to doubt it, then the oral traditions she recorded predate the war by at least a generation, likely much more. Those village accounts describe a specific type of entity, behaving in a specific way, in a specific type of terrain, in the same geographic region where soldiers from 2 opposing armies would encounter something matching that description over a decade later. Without having read Kashina's work, if this theory is correct, the war did not create the phenomenon. The war simply sent tens of thousands of people into a landscape where the phenomenon already existed. The armies arrived. The forest had been there for a very long time, and whatever was observed in it had been observed there before anyone thought to call it a military mystery. None of these four theories closes the case cleanly. None of them accounts for every documented detail without leaving something unexplained. The psychological theory fails against the German account. The wildlife theory fails against the behavioral description and the missing tracks. The psyops theory fails against Kashina. And the fourth theory is the one that removes the war as a cause entirely, which means it is the one that is hardest to confine to history. Not one of them fully explains what multiple trained soldiers, men who had faced enemy fire and had no professional incentive to report things they were not certain of, said they encountered in those trees. Stay with me, I mean it, because the final account, the one that was written by a Soviet intelligence colonel in 1943 and only partially declassified in 2003, is the one that stops being explainable by any of those four theories. And it ends mid-sentence. If this story has done something to you in the last 12 minutes, hit that like button right now. And let's finish this. The document I am about to describe is catalogued in the Russian State Military Archive under the NKVD file series, covering the Northwestern Front Intelligence Directorate. Its original classification date is March 1943. It was reclassified in 1956 under a secondary restriction order. It was partially released in 2003 as part of the post-Soviet archival access program, with 3 sections amounting to approximately 30% of the original document remaining under active restriction. Let me say that again so it lands properly. A document filed in 1943 still has sections that are restricted in 2003. 60 years later, after the USSR collapsed, after the army that wrote it ceased to exist, after the war it described ended, and was won and was commemorated and was made into monuments and museums, parts of it are still not available to researchers. The author is identified in the document header by rank and initials only. The rank is Colonel. The initials are VAK. Researchers who have studied the Northwestern Front intelligence structure have proposed several candidates for those initials. None has been officially confirmed. The document is not a piece of folklore. It is not a morale report. It is not a psychological evaluation of exhausted soldiers. Its stated purpose in the translated header is formal evaluation of reported non-hostile anomalous contacts, Volkhov Forest Sector, January through March 1943. Non-hostile. The colonel used the word non-hostile in a military intelligence document. That word was a deliberate choice. The report documents 14 separate incident reports from Soviet units operating in the sector during those 3 months. 14. Filed by 12 different officers across 8 different units over an 11-week period. The colonel notes in his methodology section that he personally investigated 8 of the 14 incidents, conducting witness interviews separately, ensuring that no witness had prior knowledge of any other witness's account before being interviewed. His finding on consistency is the sentence that researchers who have read the declassified portion have quoted most often. He writes, "The degree of consistency across independent accounts exceeds what can be attributed to coincidence, shared cultural suggestion, or coordinated fabrication. Witnesses had no contact with each other prior to debriefing. They described a consistent set of physical characteristics, behavioral patterns, and observational conditions. The entity described is bipedal, upright, and significantly larger in height than an adult male of standard build. It demonstrates apparent awareness of human presence. It does not display predatory behavior. It does not display behavior consistent with any known fauna of this region. It has been engaged with small arms fire on 2 occasions without observable effect. It leaves no physical trace in snow or soil that has been identified by morning search teams. Its origin preprinted. The sentence ends. The next line of the document is one of the 30% that remains restricted. A Soviet intelligence kernel, a formal wartime document, an 11-week investigation, 14 independent witnesses, and the sentence that was supposed to tell us where it came from is the one that someone in 1943 or in 1956 or at some point in the 6 decades since decided we should not be able to read. I don't know what that sentence said. I genuinely do not know, and I think that is the most unsettling part of this entire story. Not what the soldiers saw, not the 14 accounts, not the folkloric record that predates all of it. It is the fact that someone read that sentence and then decided to cover it. I want to say something before we get to the outro, something that I think is worth sitting with. We have a tendency, when we encounter accounts like these, to reach for the most comfortable explanation as quickly as possible. And I understand that. The uncomfortable explanations are uncomfortable for a reason. They suggest that the world is larger and stranger and less mapped than we have decided it is. And most of us have made our peace with the version of the world that fits neatly into what we already know. But I want to offer you a different frame for thinking about soldier testimony. These men were not civilians. They were not people who had stumbled into a dark forest on a camping trip and frightened themselves. They were professional military observers, trained under the harshest possible conditions to distinguish between what is real and what is not, between a threat and the wind, between a man-shaped shadow and an actual man. Their survival every single day depended on making that distinction accurately. The ones who made it inaccurately did not survive long enough to file reports. So when a Soviet intelligence colonel investigates 14 accounts from 12 different officers and concludes that they cannot be attributed to hallucination or fabrication, that conclusion is not a ghost story. It is a professional military assessment by a man whose job was to be skeptical, whose job was to find the lie in the report, the weakness in the account, the ordinary explanation for the extraordinary claim. He found no ordinary explanation, and then someone redacted the rest of what he had to say. Here is the question I want you to take with you. Not a rhetorical one, a real one with no clean answer. If the men most trained to observe the world accurately, operating in the conditions that most demand accurate observation, returned from a forest and said they saw something they could not explain, what exactly are we doing when we decide they were wrong? The soldiers who came home from that sector did not write memoirs about it, did not give interviews, did not tell the story at reunions. The ones who spoke at all spoke once, quietly, late at night, to people they trusted completely. And even then, some of them stopped before the end of the sentence. Now I want to hear from you. You have heard 5 accounts, 4 theories, and a declassified document with a redacted ending. Which theory do you believe? Which explanation actually holds up when you look at all of the evidence together? Drop it in the comments. Make your case. Tell me what I am missing. I read every single response, and I want to know what this community thinks. We set a goal of 10 likes today. If we have already crossed it by the time you are watching this, that is your support, and it genuinely means something. If we have not crossed it yet, this is your moment. It takes 1 second, And it is the difference between this channel growing and this channel staying small. Next time, we go somewhere completely different. A different war, a different continent. A mystery that took 60 years for governments on 3 separate continents to even acknowledge had a file. And when they did acknowledge it, they acknowledged it with the same word this Soviet colonel used. Non-hostile. Subscribe so you do not miss it. I will see you in the dark.